On March 14, 1863, a Union Army engineer named Cyrus Comstock filed a report about Fort Jefferson, the massive hexagonal structure rising from a coral atoll 60 miles off the Florida coast. His report, buried in the National Archives for over a century, contains a sentence that stops you cold. He wrote that certain sealed chambers beneath the main structure resist all practical investigation, and that he had been advised against further inquiry. Advised? By whom? He never says. That document sat in a folder marked simply Miscellaneous Fortification Notes, until a FOIA researcher stumbled across it in 1991. I found this while researching something else entirely. Star forts are everywhere in America. Not just a few hundreds of them scattered across the eastern seaboard, the Gulf Coast, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi Delta. Some are famous. Most are not. And the ones that aren't famous have something in common. Sealed rooms, blocked passages, foundations that don't match their stated construction dates, and dimensions that seem excessive by every military calculation we have from the era they were supposedly built. This is worth sitting with. The accepted story tells us these were purely defensive structures, geometric masterworks of military engineering designed to eliminate blind spots that plagued circular and square fortifications. A star's protruding points, called bastions, allowed defenders to cover every inch of the outer walls with enfilading fire. Elegant, practical. We have the engineering manuals to prove it. But engineering manuals don't explain everything found inside. Sealed vaults, underground aqueducts that lead nowhere obvious, cisterns far too large for their garrisons, acoustic chambers with properties that still aren't fully understood. And in at least 6 documented cases across 3 different states, evidence of construction that predates the official record by anywhere from 20 to 90 years. 20 to 90 years. That's not a rounding error. That's a different era entirely. The timeline isn't subtle. The official story goes like this. European military engineers, primarily influenced by the French theorist Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban, developed the star fort design in the late 17th century as a revolutionary solution to the problem of cannon warfare. Vauban's innovations spread rapidly through the Netherlands into Britain, across the Atlantic with colonial administrators and military planners who understood that the New World needed defending from European rivals. Spanish engineers built Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine starting in 1672. British forces constructed Fort Monroe in Virginia. Americans, after independence, launched what historians call the third system of coastal fortifications beginning around 1816, a federally funded program that eventually produced dozens of massive masonry structures along vulnerable coastlines. Let me be fair to the official narrative. This history is real. The engineering principles are sound. The archival record for many of these structures is substantial and largely consistent. Vauban's influence is genuinely visible in the geometric precision of American star forts, and the military strategic logic holds up under scrutiny. These buildings served real defensive purposes. Soldiers lived in them. Cannons fired from them. Some were besieged. Fort Pulaski in Georgia famously demonstrated the obsolescence of masonry fortifications when Union rifled artillery breached its walls in just 30 hours in April 1862. A shocking result that changed military thinking overnight. This context matters. I'm not dismissing it, but here's where the official account starts developing friction. The Third System program, as documented, was centrally administered by the Army Corps of Engineers. Budgets were allocated. Contracts were awarded. Construction timelines were recorded. And when you sit down with those records and compare them against the actual physical characteristics of these structures, you find gaps. Not everywhere, not always dramatic, but persistent enough and strange enough that they've quietly puzzled historians for generations without attracting the sustained attention they deserve. Let's start with the numbers. Fort Adams in Rhode Island is rated by the Army Corps of Engineers' own assessment as capable of housing 1,100 soldiers. The fort's internal water storage, cisterns, tunnels, and a peculiar internal drainage system was designed to sustain that population for approximately 3 years without external resupply. 3 years. Standard military doctrine of the period projected sieges lasting weeks, occasionally months, not years. The engineering isn't wrong. It works. But why design for that duration? Who planned for a 3-year siege of a harbor fort? No military scenario of the 19th century contemplated it. Speaking of water systems, Fort Jefferson on that coral atoll in the Florida Keys collected and stored rainwater through an elaborate cistern network capable of holding more than 1.5 million gallons. The fort's garrison during most of its active period never exceeded 500 men. Do the math. That capacity isn't conservative planning. That's anticipation of something larger, a much larger resident population or a much longer period of isolation. Or both. Which brings me to the sealed passages. Fort Monroe in Virginia, still an active installation until 2011, contains documented sealed rooms and blocked corridors that appear on early survey maps but were closed off sometime in the mid-19th century. The Army's official position is that these areas were sealed for structural safety reasons. Deteriorating masonry, unstable foundations. Reasonable enough. Except that independent structural engineers who examined accessible portions in 2008 found the surrounding masonry in those sections to be among the most stable in the entire structure. You seal deteriorating walls. You don't seal the strong ones. Unless the reason isn't structural. At Fort Macon in North Carolina, a 2003 restoration project broke through a section of interior wall and discovered a passage running perpendicular to the fort's known floor plan. It extended roughly 40 feet before ending at a bricked wall. The brick used to seal that passage was a different composition than the surrounding structure, a different era of manufacture, different curing characteristics. Whoever sealed it did so after the fort was already built. The National Park Service cataloged it, noted it in a technical report, and moved on. I tracked down that report. It's 3 paragraphs. 3 paragraphs for a passage to nowhere. The timing is almost theatrical. And Fort Mackinac, perched on a bluff on Mackinac Island in Michigan, contains something that genuinely stopped me when I first read the survey documentation. Beneath the main officers' quarters, surveyors in the 1970s identified a subsurface void, a cavity roughly 20 by 30 feet that doesn't correspond to any known chamber on the fort's architectural drawings. The cavity has never been excavated. Funding, according to official correspondence, was not available. 20,000 square feet of unexcavated mystery under one of Michigan's most visited historical sites, and the answer is budget constraints. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But then I found the acoustic anomalies. Several star forts, Fort Sumter in South Carolina, Fort Pickens in Florida, and the Castillo de San Marcos, contain rooms that exhibit sound dampening or sound channeling properties inconsistent with their apparent construction purpose. Castillo de San Marcos has a chamber known informally as the acoustic room that guides will demonstrate for tourists. A whisper at one end of the room is clearly audible at the opposite end, some 60 feet away. Official interpretation frames this as an architectural curiosity, perhaps an accidental byproduct of the curved masonry. Accidental. But here's what matters. The same configuration appears at Fort Pickens, nearly 1,000 miles away, in a chamber of almost identical geometry. 2 structures built by different nations, in different centuries, exhibiting the same anomalous acoustic property in similarly configured enclosed spaces. That's a coincidence. Or it's a design feature. And if it's a design feature, someone intended it. And if someone intended it, the question is what for? Because military fortifications don't require acoustic chambers. Soldiers shouting orders don't need whisper gallery physics. Communication under siege doesn't demand this particular engineering solution. But other activities might. Let me build the pattern further. Star forts in America cluster in ways that deserve examination. The major third system structures are predictably on coastlines' logical defensive positioning. But there's a second cluster that gets less attention, river junction points. Fort Chartres in Illinois, Fort de Chartres being the earlier version, commanded the confluence zone of the Mississippi River system. Fort Massac, also in Illinois, sits at a critical river junction. Fort Snelling in Minnesota occupies the precise junction of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. And Fort Pitt, the precursor structure to modern Pittsburgh, sat at the fork where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio. River junctions. Every single one. Military logic explains some of this, controlling river traffic, commanding supply lines, protecting transportation corridors. The official account covers this adequately. But river junctions also have another characteristic that military historians rarely discuss. They are natural accumulation points for trade, for goods, for underground commerce conducted away from established ports and their customs inspectors. Whoever controlled those river junctions controlled what passed through unseen as much as what passed through in plain view. Which brings me to the subterranean architecture. Fort Snelling's excavations in the 1950s revealed a series of underground storage chambers beneath the circular tower that predate the fort's official 1820s construction by what archaeologists estimated at several decades. The assessment was quiet. The chambers were documented, partially photographed, and then refilled as part of site stabilization efforts. Those photographs exist in the Minnesota Historical Society archive. I've seen them. The chambers are too large, too precisely constructed, and too well organized to be casual storage for a frontier garrison. They have shelving niches cut directly into limestone. They have ventilation channels, and they have no official explanation. Let me be clear about what I'm not claiming. I'm not proposing a single unified conspiracy. History doesn't work that way. It's messier, more layered, more interesting than a single hidden hand. What I'm suggesting is something different. That star forts in America served purposes beyond the ones we acknowledge, that those purposes were systematically obscured rather than simply forgotten, and that the physical evidence of those purposes is still present, still sealed behind brick and official disinterest, waiting. Maybe the sealed chambers stored contraband. Maybe they housed equipment for signals intelligence, early cryptographic operations, or communications infrastructure that colonial and early American administrators weren't eager to document. Maybe these structures were nodes in a network of power and information control that ran parallel to the official story of westward expansion and coastal defense. Maybe the acoustic chambers were interrogation rooms. Maybe the oversized cisterns stored something other than water at certain periods. Maybe the river junction clustering reflects a systematic effort to control inland commerce through physical infrastructure rather than institutional governance. Maybe. But here's where pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. The same features recur across structures built by different governments, in different centuries on different geological substrates, using different construction workforces. Spanish builders at Castillo de San Marcos. French engineers at Fort de Chartres. British military architects at Fort Mackinac. American Army Corps engineers at Fort Adams. They all produced sealed chambers, oversized water storage, passages that appear on early surveys and vanish from later ones, and acoustic properties that have no obvious military application. Different builders. Same anomalies. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The pattern pushes you toward a specific question. Was there a template? Not a physical template. Not one set of plans passed from hand to hand across the Atlantic. But a functional template. A set of requirements perhaps transmitted through Masonic networks, through military engineering societies, through trade guilds with transatlantic connections, that specified certain features for reasons that were never written into the official record because writing them down was precisely the point to avoid. Freemasonry is usually where amateur theorists derail into unfalsifiable territory, and I want to be careful here. But the documented historical connection between Freemasonry and early American military engineering is not speculation. It's established history. George Washington, who oversaw the construction of numerous defensive installations, was a Mason. Pierre Charles L'Enfant, who designed the street grid of Washington, D.C. with its now famous geometric alignments, was connected to the same networks. The Army Corps of Engineers drew heavily, in its formative years, from men embedded in those fraternal structures. This isn't sinister by itself, but it does mean that certain design philosophies could have traveled through social networks that left no paper trail, because Masonic communication was deliberately oral, deliberately unrecorded. The timeline isn't subtle, and neither is the geography. Consider the positioning of sealed interior chambers across the documented cases. They consistently appear in the section of the fort farthest from the primary entrance, accessible only through interior corridors that would be impossible to reach under active garrison conditions without the knowledge and cooperation of the commanding officer. This isn't incidental. You don't accidentally put your storage in the hardest location to access. You put things there that you need to reach rarely, discreetly, and with controlled access. That's a security design. And security design implies something worth securing. Fort Jefferson again. That FOIA document I mentioned at the start, Cyrus Comstock's 1863 report. He was inspecting the fort during its wartime use as a military prison, the place where Dr. Samuel Mudd was imprisoned for his role in Lincoln's assassination. Comstock was methodical, technically precise, and clearly experienced. He measured everything. He noted everything. And yet, in describing the sealed chambers beneath the main structure, he offers not dimensions, not materials, not construction characteristics, just that advisory against further inquiry. A man who measured wall thicknesses to the inch simply stops measuring. He was told to stop. Who tells a Union Army engineer during wartime to stop investigating a military facility? Not a contractor, not a local administrator. The chain of command that could issue such instruction to a man of Comstock's rank was short. And what sits at the top of a short chain? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. That's not a rhetorical hedge. It's the honest answer, and it matters that I give you the honest answer rather than the satisfying one. The satisfying answer would connect every thread into a clean revelation. But historical investigation, real historical investigation, ends in rooms you cannot fully enter, in documents that are missing, in sealed chambers that remain sealed, in questions that outlast the people who could have answered them. What I do know is this: dozens of star forts across America contain physical anomalies that the official record doesn't adequately explain. I know that sealed passages, oversized cisterns, acoustic chambers, and chambers predating official construction dates recur across structures built by separate nations over separate centuries. I know that at least one documented federal engineer was specifically instructed to discontinue his investigation of those sealed spaces. I know that subsequent academic attention to these anomalies has been, at best, fitful three-paragraph technical notes, unfunded excavation proposals, photographs taken and then buried in archive folders. History has a way of accommodating what powerful people find convenient. And somewhere in that accommodation, something got lost. Or not lost, concealed. There's a distinction. Things get lost through neglect, through time, through the ordinary entropy of record-keeping. Things get concealed through intention. The difference matters because intention implies purpose, and purpose implies knowledge, and knowledge implies that somewhere, in a sealed room beneath a hexagonal fort on a coral atoll, or behind a brick wall in a North Carolina state park, or in an unexcavated cavity beneath a bluff in Michigan, there is an answer. It has been sitting there in the dark for a very long time. The tour guides at these places will tell you about cannons. They'll show you the barracks, the officers' quarters, the imposing geometry of the walls from the visitor walkway. They're telling you the truth, just not all of it. And most visitors leave satisfied. They got the story, the shape of the walls, the dates on the placard. But Cyrus Comstock went looking beneath the shape of the walls, and someone told him to stop. Whatever he found in those sealed chambers under Fort Jefferson, whatever he was prevented from measuring, from documenting, from including in his precise and thorough military survey, left an imprint in a single sentence of a report filed under miscellaneous fortification notes, where it waited in the dark for over a century for someone to ask the right question. We still haven't asked all of them.